The soft click of the lawyer's leather shoes echoed against the marble floors of the grand estate. A house so expansive it swallowed sound as easily as it consumed the warmth of human interaction. Alexander Hayes sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, his posture stiff, radiating control even in a moment of loss. He was the picture of success. Tailored suit perfectly hugging his broad shoulders, his dark hair immaculately styled, and his eyes, cold and calculating, scanning the room like a king overseeing his court. His empire, inherited from a family legacy that stretched back generations, had never felt more secure, even with the passing of his father. The house, the estate, the company, everything was his now. His father's death was not unexpected. Age had slowly whittled the old man down. Alexander had already planned for this, for the transition of power. Yet, today, as the lawyer opened the thick, cream-colored envelope with the family seal, Alexander couldn't help but feel the slightest twinge of unease. He dismissed it immediately, chalking it up to the natural discomfort of finality. But something about the way Martin Holbrook, his father's longtime attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his chair didn't sit right. Martin had always been the very definition of composure, unflappable and precise. Today, though, there was a hesitation in his movements, a reluctance in the way he smoothed out the document before him. The tension in the air was subtle but tangible, like the distant rumble of a storm that hadn't yet reached the horizon but was inevitable nonetheless. As Martin cleared his throat, the room seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the sun hung low, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured gardens. Through the tall windows, Alexander could see the vast expanse of perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds, meticulously maintained by the team of gardeners that had served his family for decades. He was a man who appreciated order, control, and precision, and his estate reflected that in every corner. Nothing was ever out of place in his world. "Mr. Hayes," Martin began, his voice thick with the weight of what he was about to say. "As per your father's final wishes, there is one last condition that must be fulfilled before the entirety of the estate can be transferred to your name." A flicker of irritation passed across Alexander's face, though it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. His father had always been a man of principles, sometimes to a fault, and Alexander had assumed the will would be straightforward, a mere formality in the grand scheme of things. He'd spent his entire life preparing to take over the empire, after all. What could possibly complicate that now? "Get on with it," Alexander said coolly, his fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface of the table. His voice was sharp, cutting through the growing unease in the room. Martin hesitated, eyes scanning the document once more as if searching for a way to soften the blow. But there was no gentle way to reveal what had been written. "Your father's will stipulates that in order for you to inherit the estate and the company, you must marry Valerie Mitchell, the daughter of the head gardener, within the next 60 days. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner of the room. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Alexander blinked, and then a sharp, incredulous laugh escaped his lips. It was a laugh devoid of humor, more of a reflex than a genuine reaction. "This must be some kind of joke." "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. His eyes, previously distant and detached, now locked onto Martin's with an intensity that made the older man shift uneasily in his seat. There was no room for misunderstanding. Martin didn't flinch, though his discomfort was clear. "It's not a joke, Mr. Hayes. It's all here in writing. Your father had his reasons, though he did not fully explain them in the document. He simply stated that fulfilling this condition was of the utmost importance, and that failure to do so would result in forfeiting the entire inheritance." Valerie Mitchell. The name was familiar, of course. Alexander vaguely remembered her from his childhood. A quiet, unremarkable girl who had played in the gardens while her father, George Mitchell, worked tirelessly to keep the estate grounds pristine. The Mitchell family had served the Hayes for generations, tending to the land with a kind of care and devotion that Alexander had never bothered to fully appreciate. To him, they were just another part of the machine that kept his world running smoothly. He couldn't recall much about Valerie, though. She had been a shadow, always in the background, insignificant, a gardener's daughter. And now his father was telling him, from beyond the grave, that he had to marry her? The idea was absurd, infuriating even. Alexander was a man of wealth and status. He could have any woman he desired, models, socialites, women who understood the life he led, the power he wielded. Why in the world would he marry her? What kind of nonsense is this? Alexander's voice was a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. This is my father's estate, his company. He spent his life building this empire for me, and now you're telling me I have to throw it all away because of some ridiculous clause? Marry the gardener's daughter? It's outrageous. Martin, ever the professional, remained calm in the face of Alexander's growing fury. I understand this is a lot to take in, Mr. Hayes, but your father was very clear. He felt strongly that this was necessary for reasons he did not disclose. If you choose not to comply, the estate will be liquidated, and the proceeds will be donated to charity. Alexander's jaw clenched, his mind racing. Liquidated? His father had been a hard, shrewd businessman, not prone to sentimentality. And yet here he was, from beyond the grave, dictating terms that made no sense. Was this some kind of twisted moral lesson? A way to teach him humility? His father had always criticized him for his arrogance, his inability to see beyond the surface of things, but surely this wasn't the way. What if I refuse? Alexander asked, though the answer was already clear. Martin sighed, folding his hands over the document. Then, I'm afraid you lose everything. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Everything. His home, his fortune, his company, the very things that defined him. And all because of a woman he hadn't spoken to in years. A woman who was as far from his world as anyone could be. But the question wasn't just about wealth. It was about pride. Could he really allow himself to be forced into something like this? Could he swallow his pride for the sake of the empire he'd spent his entire life preparing to inherit? His mind swirled with conflicting thoughts, anger and confusion battling for dominance. In the back of his mind, though, a new question began to form, quiet but insistent. Who is Valerie Mitchell now, and why would his father think she was so important? As Alexander stared at the document in front of him, the storm inside him raged on. His world, so carefully controlled and meticulously ordered, had just been thrown into chaos. And at the center of it all was a woman he barely remembered, yet who now held the key to his entire future. How was he going to navigate this marriage, a marriage that challenged everything he believed in? The days following the reading of the will felt like a blur for Alexander Hayes. A man used to snapping his fingers and having the world bend to his will, he now found himself standing on shaky ground. He couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to him, the bitter taste of defeat that came from being forced into a marriage he neither wanted nor believed in. Yet, the alternative, to walk away from his family's empire, was simply out of the question. The arrangements were swift, cold, and transactional, just like Alexander liked to handle his business. There was no time for elaborate wedding plans, no talks of romance or love. He wasn't marrying for love, after all. He was marrying for legacy, for duty, for pride. A private ceremony was arranged in the mansion's garden, attended by a handful of staff and the lawyer, Martin Holbrook, as the sole witness. The vows felt hollow, mechanical, as if they were reciting the terms of a business contract rather than making promises of forever. Valerie Mitchell, his new wife, stood beside him that day with an expression as neutral as possible. She wore a simple white dress that did nothing to compete with the elegance of the estate, yet there was something undeniably graceful about the way she carried herself. Her eyes, clear, brown, and impossibly steady, never wavered. She did not show signs of excitement or fear, nor did she look at Alexander with any of the awe he was used to receiving from people. To her, it seemed, this marriage was as much a burden as it was to him. Alexander had assumed she'd be overwhelmed by the grandeur of his world, by the wealth and the power that surrounded him. In his mind, this union was a clear hierarchy. He was the one bestowing his name, his resources, and his privilege upon someone far beneath him in social standing. Surely Valerie would understand that. Surely she would be thankful. But in the week that followed the quiet wedding, Alexander discovered how deeply he had misjudged her. There was no gratitude, no reverence in her demeanor. Valerie carried herself as if she belonged in the mansion, walking through the lavish halls with a quiet confidence that unnerved him. She was polite but distant, kind but not deferential, and worst of all, she did not seem to care about the wealth that surrounded her. Alexander's attempts to assert control started small, subtle. He had no intention of making this marriage anything more than it needed to be, an arrangement that fulfilled the terms of his father's will, but he still expected Valerie to fall in line. He expected her to recognize who held the power in this relationship. The first test came one morning over breakfast. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light through the large bay windows of the dining room. The table was long, unnecessarily so for two people, and Alexander sat at one end while Valerie sat at the other. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating, as they sipped their coffee in near complete isolation from one another. Alexander set his cup down with a soft clink, clearing his throat as he prepared to break the quiet. "I've spoken to my assistant," he began, his tone matter-of-fact, "and I've arranged for you to have access to one of the personal shoppers in town. You can pick out whatever wardrobe you like. I'm sure you'll want to upgrade to something more suitable for your new role." It was more of a statement than a suggestion. Alexander had fully expected Valerie to accept his offer without hesitation. In his world, this was how things were done. People with money and status dressed the part, and Valerie, despite her quiet grace, did not fit the image of what his wife should look like. But Valerie didn't answer right away. She didn't even seem fazed by his remark. Instead, she calmly set down her coffee cup, dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin, and then, with deliberate slowness, she met his gaze. "Thank you, Alexander," she said in a measured tone, "but I'm perfectly comfortable with the clothes I have." Her answer wasn't defiant, but it wasn't the obedient response he had anticipated either. She wasn't refusing him outright, yet she was dismissing his suggestion with a calm firmness that rankled him. Alexander stared at her for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Comfortable," he echoed, his voice laced with a quiet edge. "Valerie, I don't think you understand. This is not about comfort. It's about presentation. My wife, our name, is associated with this estate, this company. People will expect you to look a certain way." Her eyes didn't waver, and Alexander felt a prick of irritation at how collected she remained, even under the weight of his words. "I appreciate your concern," she replied softly, "but I don't believe people should judge me, or us, based on what I wear. I'd rather they see me for who I am." Her answer was simple, but it hit Alexander like a slap. Who she was, the arrogance of it, the quiet audacity. Did she truly think that being herself was enough in his world? In the circles he moved in, image was everything. Appearances were more important than substance, and the idea that she could reject that truth so casually gnawed at him. The tension between them deepened as the days passed. Every interaction became a subtle battle for control, a tug-of-war that Alexander hadn't anticipated. He found himself constantly on edge around her, as if every word she spoke was a calculated move to undermine his authority. She didn't do it openly. Valerie wasn't confrontational in the traditional sense. No, her defiance came in the form of quiet resistance, in the way she refused to conform to his expectations, in the way she held her own without ever raising her voice or showing emotion. It was maddening. One evening, after another dinner laced with tension, Alexander decided to confront the growing unease head-on. He found Valerie in the library, seated in a plush armchair near the fireplace. The warm glow of the fire reflected off the spines of the books lining the shelves, casting long shadows across the room. She was reading, the flickering light dancing across her calm features. For a moment, Alexander simply watched her, trying to figure out what it was about this woman that unsettled him so much. She wasn't what he had expected. She didn't beg for his attention or try to win his approval. She existed in his world as if she had always belonged, as if she had nothing to prove. And perhaps that was what infuriated him most. Her sense of independence, her quiet strength. It was a strength he hadn't seen coming. "Valerie," he called out, his voice breaking the peaceful silence of the room. She looked up, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. "Yes." He stepped closer, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. "We need to talk." Closing her book, Valerie placed it on the side table and folded her hands in her lap. "All right, what is it?" Alexander hesitated for a brief moment, searching for the right words. He wasn't used to having to explain himself, especially not to someone like her. But this marriage, this arrangement, was wearing on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "Do you even understand the position you're in?" he asked, his voice low but simmering with frustration. "Do you understand what this marriage means for you? For us?" Valerie's brow furrowed slightly, though her expression remained calm. "I understand that this is a marriage neither of us chose," she said. "But I also understand that it's more than a transaction, at least to your father." At the mention of his father, Alexander's temper flared. "This isn't about him," he snapped. "This is about us. About how this is going to work. I'm trying to make this easy for you, Valerie. I'm offering you things, opportunities that people like you could only dream of. But you keep pushing back, acting like none of it matters." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Valerie's face. Her eyes, usually so steady, hardened slightly. "People like me?" she repeated, her tone edged with disbelief. Alexander's heart skipped a beat, realizing too late how his words had sounded. But before he could explain, she stood, her movements calm but deliberate. She was shorter than him by a good few inches, but in that moment, she seemed to stand taller. "I don't want your opportunities, Alexander," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I didn't marry you for your money or your name or anything that comes with it. This marriage wasn't my choice, but I accepted it because of your father. Not because I want anything from you." Alexander opened his mouth to speak, but Valerie wasn't finished. "You think this is all about power and control, but it's not. Not to me." Her gaze softened slightly, though her tone remained resolute. "You can offer me all the wealth in the world, but that doesn't mean you own me. I may be your wife on paper, but that doesn't mean I'll change who I am to fit into your life." Her words stung more than Alexander wanted to admit. There was no anger in her voice, no venom, just truth. She was telling him, in no uncertain terms, that she wouldn't bend to his will. And somehow that infuriated him even more. "You're not making this easy," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Valerie sighed softly, her expression softening even further. "This isn't easy for either of us, Alexander. But I'm not your enemy." For a moment, silence filled the space between them. Alexander stared at her, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. He had expected Valerie to be a problem, but not like this. Not in a way that challenged his very perception of power and control. As he left the library that night, his thoughts swirling, one thing became painfully clear. This marriage was going to be far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt a sense of uncertainty, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. Days stretched into weeks, and the growing tension between Alexander and Valerie settled into a kind of uneasy truce. They moved through the vast mansion like two strangers bound by invisible chains, orbiting each other but never truly connecting. Alexander found himself more frustrated than ever. He was used to dominating every aspect of his life, business, relationships, power, but Valerie was a puzzle he couldn't solve. Her calm demeanor was like an impenetrable wall, and it made him feel strangely powerless. It wasn't that Valerie was overtly defiant or openly combative. No, her resistance was subtle, quiet, and maddeningly composed. Every time he thought he could control the narrative of their marriage, she would say something or do something that reminded him of how little he truly knew about her. She had built a world of her own inside his mansion, one that he couldn't penetrate. She spent her days in the garden or in the library, avoiding the lavish social functions Alexander typically attended. He had offered to introduce her to the influential circles he frequented, but she had politely declined, expressing no interest in that life, and that infuriated him. On one particularly stormy evening, after yet another day of strained silence, Alexander found himself drawn to the library once again. The fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the shelves of old, leather-bound books that his father had cherished. Alexander poured himself a drink, the ice clinking in the glass as he settled into a chair. His eyes wandered over the room, over the old family photos lining the shelves, over the memories of a man who had ruled his life with an iron will. The portrait of his father hung above the fireplace, a constant reminder of the towering figure who had shaped every decision Alexander had ever made. His father's presence was inescapable, even in death. And now it was his father's last wish, the bizarre clause in the will, that still controlled him. But why her? Alexander couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would his father, a man who valued status and power above all else, want him to marry the daughter of the gardener? It made no sense. The thought nagged at him, gnawing at his pride and logic like an unsolved riddle. There had to be something he was missing, some piece of the puzzle he hadn't uncovered. As he sipped his whiskey, Alexander's mind drifted back to Valerie. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, impossible to predict, impossible to control. But there was something else, something beneath the surface that he couldn't quite grasp. He didn't understand her, and that frightened him more than he cared to admit. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Valerie entered the library, her presence as quiet and calm as ever. She didn't seem surprised to find him there. In fact, she rarely seemed surprised by anything, as if nothing in this world could unsettle her. She offered him a polite smile but said nothing as she moved to the other side of the room, selecting a book from one of the shelves. For a few minutes, they existed in silence, the crackle of the fire and the soft patter of rain against the windows the only sounds between them. But something about the stillness tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Alexander cleared his throat, breaking the quiet. "You spend a lot of time in here," he remarked, his voice more of an observation than a question. Valerie looked up from her book, her expression thoughtful. "It's peaceful here," she replied simply. "I've always liked libraries." He nodded, unsure of how to continue. He wasn't good at small talk, and every attempt at conversation with her felt like navigating a minefield. But tonight he couldn't let it go. He needed answers. Answers to the questions that had been plaguing him since the day they'd married. "Why did you agree to this?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of the frustration he'd been holding back for weeks. "This marriage. Why did you go through with it?" Valerie's eyes met his, and for a moment, she seemed to weigh her response. Her face, as always, was calm, but there was something different in her gaze tonight, a flicker of emotion that she rarely allowed him to see. "I didn't have a choice," she said softly. Alexander frowned. "Of course you had a choice. No one forced you." Valerie sighed, setting the book down on the side table. She walked toward the window, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the glass as she stared out into the rain-soaked night. The storm outside mirrored the growing storm inside Alexander, and for a moment, the silence between them stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Valerie spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your father made a promise to my father." The words hung in the air like a lead weight, pulling Alexander's thoughts in a direction he hadn't expected. He stood, his drink forgotten on the table, as he walked closer to her. "What kind of promise?" Valerie turned, her eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that caught him off guard. "A promise to protect our family. Years ago, your father did something that destroyed everything my family had." Alexander blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift in the conversation. "What are you talking about?" Valerie took a deep breath, as if summoning the strength to speak the words that had been buried for so long. "Years ago, my father worked as the head gardener for your family, just as his father had before him. We lived on the estate, and for a long time everything was fine. But then, one day, your father decided to sell off a large portion of the land that my family had lived on for generations. He didn't tell us until it was too late. We lost our home, our livelihood, everything. My father was devastated. He tried to fight it, but there was nothing he could do." Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he listened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. His mind raced back to the business deals his father had made, the ruthless decisions that had built the empire they now stood in. He had always admired his father's cold efficiency, his ability to make hard choices without blinking. But he had never thought about the people those choices had affected. "My father," Alexander repeated, his voice low. "I don't understand. Why would my father do that?" Valerie's eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. "Because he didn't care. To him, we were just workers, disposable. But after my father lost everything, your father felt guilty. He knew he had done wrong, but by then the damage was already done. So he made a promise. He promised my father that he would take care of me, that he would make things right." Alexander stood frozen, his mind reeling from the weight of her words. The world as he knew it shifted on its axis. His father, the man he had idolized, the man whose legacy he had fought to protect, had wronged her family. And this marriage, this union that Alexander had fought against, was his father's way of trying to make amends. "He thought marrying me to you would fix things," Valerie continued, her voice filled with a quiet bitterness. "He thought it would somehow erase the years of pain my father went through, the years of struggling to rebuild our lives after losing everything." Alexander's throat tightened as the truth settled over him like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't about legacy or duty. It wasn't about power or control. This was about guilt, his father's guilt. And now Alexander was paying the price for it. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. Valerie's expression softened, but there was no forgiveness in her eyes. "How could you have known? You've spent your whole life in a world where people like my family don't matter. We were just background noise to you, to your father." Alexander swallowed hard, the reality of her words sinking in. His father had built an empire on the backs of people like Valerie's family, and now Alexander was faced with the consequences of that legacy. He had been so focused on controlling his marriage, on bending Valerie to his will, that he had never stopped to consider the history between them, the history that had shaped who she was. "What do you want from me?" Alexander asked, his voice hoarse. "How am I supposed to fix this?" Valerie shook her head. "This isn't something you can fix, Alexander. This isn't about you. My father is gone, and so is yours. But the damage they caused lives on. All I want is for you to understand that this marriage isn't about money or power. It's about the past, and what it's done to us." For the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly powerless. The weight of his father's actions, the realization that his entire world was built on the suffering of others, crushed him. He had spent his life chasing success, chasing control, only to find that it had all been an illusion. He couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the pain that had been caused. And now he was faced with the harsh truth that his father had never been the man he thought he was. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He had never had to apologize before, never truly had to face the consequences of his actions, or those of his father. But here, standing in front of Valerie, he realized that his power, his wealth, meant nothing. Valerie's gaze softened slightly, but she didn't reach out to him. "Sorry isn't enough, Alexander. It never is. But maybe, just maybe, you can learn from this. Maybe you can be different." Her words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Alexander didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the quiet strength in her voice. All he knew was that the world he had known was gone, and in its place stood a future filled with uncertainty. A future where he could no longer rely on the power and privilege that had once defined him. As Valerie turned to leave the library, Alexander felt a knot form in his chest. He had spent so much time resenting her, fighting against the marriage, only to realize that she had been carrying the weight of his father's sins all along. She had been the one wronged, the one forced into a life she hadn't chosen. And now she was giving him a chance to change. The question was, could he do it? Could he become the man his father had never been? As the storm raged outside, Alexander stood alone in the library, staring at the portrait of his father. For the first time, he saw the man not as a hero, but as a flawed, broken individual. And for the first time, Alexander understood what it meant to carry the burden of someone else's mistakes. The journey ahead would be long, and redemption would not come easily. But for the first time, Alexander felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, humility, and with it, hope. If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. The days after Valerie's revelation were a blur for Alexander. He walked the halls of the mansion as if in a trance, every corner of his estate suddenly feeling unfamiliar, like a home that wasn't truly his. His entire life, he had believed in the strength of his family's legacy, the righteousness of his father's success. But now, knowing the truth about the land deal that had ruined Valerie's family, that legacy felt like a lie. Everything he had once been so sure of had crumbled, leaving him feeling more lost than ever. For the first time in his life, Alexander was unsure of himself. He had built his identity on the foundation of power and control, of being the man who made things happen, who never bent to anyone else's will. But now, he had to face the reality that the very empire he had spent his life inheriting and protecting was built on the suffering of others, on the destruction of Valerie's family, no less. He found it hard to look her in the eyes now, not because of her coldness or her defiance, but because of the weight of his own guilt. Valerie had carried the burden of that betrayal in silence for years, and Alexander had only seen her as an obstacle in his path, a woman whose quiet strength had been mistaken for stubbornness. Now he saw her in a different light, but the damage had already been done. The transformation that was beginning in Alexander wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. His instincts still pushed him to seek control, to try and manage the situation in the ways he knew best. But there was no managing this. The more he tried to regain his sense of power, the more it slipped through his fingers. The rules of his world had changed, and Alexander was starting to understand that he had to change, too, if he had any hope of fixing the mess his father had created, and that he had perpetuated by his own arrogance. One morning, as he stared at his reflection in the ornate mirror of his bathroom, Alexander hardly recognized the man looking back at him. The sharp, confident gaze that had once been his trademark was gone, replaced by something much more uncertain. The weight of the truth hung heavily on his shoulders, and for the first time, he wondered if he even deserved to carry the Hayes name. The memory of Valerie's words from that night in the library echoed in his mind, over and over again. "This isn't something you can fix, Alexander. This isn't about you. My father is gone, and so is yours. But the damage they caused lives on. He couldn't fix it." Those words struck him harder than anything else. He had spent his entire life believing that there wasn't a problem he couldn't solve, an obstacle he couldn't overcome if he just threw enough money or power at it. But this was different. No amount of wealth or influence could undo the pain his father had caused, and Alexander was beginning to understand just how powerless that made him feel. As he made his way downstairs, the house was unusually quiet. He found Valerie in the garden, as he often did these days. It had become her sanctuary, the one place in the mansion where she seemed to truly belong. She knelt by a bed of roses, her hands gently tending to the flowers, her fingers brushing the delicate petals as if they were the most precious thing in the world. Alexander stood at a distance, watching her for a moment. She moved with a grace that he had never appreciated before. Calm, steady, unhurried. She had the same quiet strength that her father must have had. A strength that wasn't loud or forceful, but deep and unyielding. It was a strength that Alexander realized he had always lacked. Clearing his throat, he approached her, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, to not knowing the right words to fix things. But he knew he had to start somewhere. "Valerie," he began, his voice soft, almost hesitant. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Yes." Alexander swallowed hard, the words he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly feeling inadequate. I wanted to apologize." Valerie's brow furrowed slightly, though she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I know that words aren't enough," he said quickly, feeling a sudden rush of nervousness. He wasn't used to being this exposed. "But I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For what my father did. For what I've done." Valerie stood, brushing the dirt from her hands, her gaze never leaving his. She didn't say anything at first, and the silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for her to respond, unsure of what she would say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Valerie spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Alexander," she said, her tone measured. "But like I told you before, sorry isn't enough. This isn't something you can just fix with an apology." "I know," he replied quickly. "I know that, but I want to try to make things right. I don't know how, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Valerie's eyes softened slightly, though her expression remained guarded. "It's not about making things right, Alexander. Some things can't be made right. You can't undo the past." "I know," he repeated, his voice quieter now, "but I can try to be different. I can try to change." For the first time, Valerie's gaze faltered, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. She looked down at the roses, her fingers gently tracing the petals. "Change is hard," she said quietly, "especially for people like you." The words stung, but Alexander knew she was right. Change had never been something he'd valued. He had built his life on consistency, on being the man who never wavered, never bent. But now, for the first time, he realized that his refusal to change had only brought him further from what mattered. "I'm trying," he said softly. "I don't know if I'll ever be the kind of man you can trust, but I'm trying." Valerie looked up at him again, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "It's not about trust, Alexander. It's about whether you're willing to let go of the man you think you need to be." The words hit him harder than he expected. Let go. That was something he had never considered before. Letting go meant losing control, and losing control was something Alexander had always feared. But maybe that was the key. Maybe, in order to truly change, he needed to stop holding so tightly to the identity he had built for himself, the identity that had been shaped by his father's expectations, by the world of power and wealth that had defined him for so long. Over the next few weeks, Alexander began to take small steps toward that change. He started by reevaluating the way he handled his business. For years, he had followed in his father's footsteps, making decisions that were profitable but often at the expense of others. Now, with Valerie's words still fresh in his mind, he found himself questioning those decisions. He began reaching out to small businesses that had been affected by his company's expansion, offering financial reparations and assistance to help them rebuild. It wasn't enough to erase the past, but it was a start. He also started spending more time with the workers on the estate, people he had once ignored or taken for granted. He walked the grounds, speaking to the gardeners, the housekeepers, the staff who had kept his world running smoothly for years without ever receiving a word of thanks. It was awkward at first. He wasn't used to interacting with them on a personal level, but slowly he began to understand the importance of these connections. They weren't just faceless employees. They were people with stories and struggles of their own. And for the first time, Alexander realized how much he had overlooked in his pursuit of success. But while his efforts to change were genuine, they were not without setbacks. The hardest part, by far, was mending his relationship with Valerie. She had seen the worst of him, his arrogance, his entitlement, his selfishness, and earning her trust, if it was even possible, would take time. Every conversation with her felt like walking on a tightrope, one wrong step threatening to undo all the progress he had made. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alexander found himself once again standing outside the garden where Valerie was working. She was kneeling by the flower beds, her hair falling in loose waves around her face, the setting sun casting a warm glow over her. He approached her cautiously, unsure of how to begin. "You've been working out here a lot," he remarked, trying to start a conversation. Valerie glanced up at him, wiping the dirt from her hands. "It's where I feel most at peace." Alexander nodded, hesitating before speaking again. "I've been thinking about what you said, about change, and I know I can't make up for what's happened, but I want to be different. I want to be better." Valerie looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Change isn't about words, Alexander. It's about actions." He nodded again, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know. I've been trying. But it feels like nothing I do will ever be enough." For the first time in weeks, Valerie's gaze softened. She stood, dusting off her hands, and walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. "Maybe it won't be enough," she said softly. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. Change is hard. It's messy, and it takes time." Alexander swallowed, the weight of her words settling over him. He had spent so long trying to be perfect, to be the man his father had wanted him to be, that he had forgotten what it meant to be real, to be vulnerable. "I don't want to be like him," Alexander admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Valerie looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Then don't be." The simplicity of her words struck him, and for the first time Alexander felt a sense of clarity. He didn't have to be his father. He didn't have to carry the weight of that legacy. He could forge a new path, one that wasn't defined by power or control, but by something deeper. As the sun set behind them, casting the garden in a warm, golden light, Alexander realized that the journey ahead would be long and difficult. But for the first time he felt ready to face it. Not as the man he had been, but as the man he wanted to become. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. If you are liking the story, don't forget to subscribe to help us continue bringing stories every day. The following weeks marked a quiet but steady change in Alexander. The man who had once ruled his world with an iron fist now walked more softly through life. It wasn't that he had solved all his problems or erased the mistakes of his past, but the arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced by something deeper: humility. His attempts to reconcile with Valerie had been slow, patient. He knew that trust, once broken, could not be easily repaired. But he also knew that his efforts weren't just for her. They were for himself. The man he had been, the man he no longer wanted to be, was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned, painfully, that control was an illusion, and that real strength came from vulnerability and accountability. Valerie had noticed the change, though she rarely acknowledged it aloud. She watched him with cautious eyes, like someone observing a tree after a storm, unsure if it would survive or break. Her presence in his life was constant but still distant, like the roses she tended in the garden, beautiful but guarded by thorns. The mansion, once filled with cold grandeur, now seemed smaller, more human. Alexander had begun inviting the staff to dine with him on occasion, a practice unheard of in the Hayes household. He walked the grounds regularly, speaking with the workers not as their employer, but as someone seeking to understand their lives. It was awkward at first, but over time, the walls between them began to come down. Still, one wall remained, the one between him and Valerie. They shared the same house, the same meals, and sometimes the same quiet conversations, but there was a distance between them that neither seemed to know how to bridge. Alexander had hoped that by changing himself, by showing her he was no longer the man he had once been, things would fall into place. But life, like relationships, was not that simple. One evening, after a long day spent reviewing business changes and meeting with local small business owners, a new practice he had adopted in an effort to repair the damage his father's company had done, Alexander found himself standing on the terrace, staring out at the garden. The night was cool, and the stars above shimmered like distant, untouchable lights. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle on his shoulders. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of footsteps. He didn't need to turn to know it was Valerie. She often walked the gardens at night, finding peace among the flowers in a way that he envied. Tonight, though, there was something different in the air between them, a tension that had been growing, unresolved, since the night she had revealed the truth about their fathers. "Valerie," he said softly, turning to face her. She paused a few feet away, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression as guarded as ever. "Alexander." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the cool breeze playing with the loose strands of Valerie's hair. Alexander didn't know where to start. So much had been left unsaid between them, and yet, it felt as if they had already said everything. Finally, Valerie broke the silence. "I've noticed," she said quietly, her eyes meeting his. "You've changed." Alexander's heart tightened in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was from hope or fear. "I've been trying," he admitted. "I didn't realize until all of this how much I needed to." Valerie nodded, her gaze softening but still wary. "Change is hard," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to him weeks ago. "It's not something most people can do." He stepped closer, his heart pounding. "I know, but I want to keep trying. Not just for you, but for myself. For the people I've wronged." Her expression remained guarded, though there was something vulnerable in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "And what do you want from me, Alexander?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment he didn't know how to answer. What did he want? Forgiveness? Acceptance? A chance to rebuild something with her? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't expect anything. I just want you to know that I see you now. I understand why you're angry, why you couldn't trust me, and I don't blame you for any of it." Valerie's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe sadness. She turned her gaze toward the garden, her voice quiet when she spoke again. "I wasn't just angry at you. I was angry at the whole situation, at your father, at my father, at how everything seemed to be out of my control. I never wanted this marriage, and I definitely didn't want to feel like I was trapped in a world that wasn't mine." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always known, in the abstract, that she didn't want this life, but hearing her say it, so plainly, brought a fresh wave of guilt crashing over him. His father had done this to her. He had trapped her in a life she never asked for. "I know," he whispered, "and I'm sorry." Valerie turned to face him again, her eyes searching his. "I believe you," she said, her voice soft. "I believe that you're sorry, and I believe that you're trying to change. But that doesn't mean everything can go back to the way it was. I'm still figuring out what I want from this. From us." Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. He had hoped that by changing himself, by making amends, things between them would somehow fall into place. But life didn't work like that. Trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight, and forgiveness, if it ever came, would take time. "I understand," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't expect you to forgive me or even to stay, but I hope you'll give me the chance to show you that I'm not the man I used to be." Valerie looked at him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I can see that you're trying," she said softly, "and maybe, in time, we can figure out what this marriage really means. But it's going to take more than words. It's going to take time." Alexander nodded, the tightness in his chest easing slightly. It wasn't a promise of forgiveness, but it was something, a chance. And right now, that was more than he had ever expected. They stood in silence for a few moments, the cool night air swirling around them. For the first time since their marriage, Alexander felt something close to peace. It wasn't perfect. Nothing in his life was perfect anymore. But it was a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As Valerie turned to leave, she paused at the edge of the terrace, her hand resting lightly on the stone railing. She glanced back at him, her eyes soft but still cautious. "I'll be in the garden," she said quietly, before disappearing into the night. Alexander watched her go, his heart heavy but hopeful. The road ahead would be long, and it would be filled with challenges he couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them. Not with arrogance or control, but with humility and patience. The mansion behind him, once a symbol of his power and wealth, now felt different. It wasn't just a house. It was a place where he could start over, where he could rebuild not only his life, but his relationship with Valerie. As he turned back to the stars, Alexander allowed himself to hope, not for a perfect ending, but for the possibility of growth, of healing. And in that moment, he realized that maybe that was all anyone could ask for. Thank you so much for watching. We hope Alexander and Valerie's journey left an impact on you, just like it did on us. Stories of growth, redemption, and second chances remind us how powerful change can be, especially when it's hardest. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Do you think Alexander deserves Valerie's trust again? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it. And hey, if you're not already part of our family, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another story like this one. We have more emotional journeys just waiting for you. Also, don't forget to watch the next story that's already on your screen. Trust us, it's one you won't want to miss. See you there.